Okay, guys, so part two, I'm gonna try to bring this to a wrap here. So I established that Jun Fan Gung Do, as is currently known, is a system comprising three arts that Bruce developed over his martial arts career. First was Tao of Gung Fu, which was like mostly Wing Chun Kung Fu, mixed with some northern and southern styles. Northern being mostly kicking, southern being mostly hands. Okay, and after an infamous fight he had with this guy named Wong Jack Man, he decided to uh, add in some cross training and elements from boxing and fencing and savate into his art, which became formally known as Jun Fan Gung Fu, and he has certified a couple of people in it. His best friend Taki Kimura, his other best friend James Lee, who died back in the '60s, late '60s, and never produced any instructors under himself, as far as I knew, but may have given like formal recognition to a few people that they were advanced students in the art, and of course Dan Inosanto, who held certification in all three of his arts: Style of Gung Fu, Jun Fan Gung Fu, and later Jeet Kune Do. So, what was the difference between Jeet Kune Do and Jun Fan Gung Fu? This was Bruce's further refinement of his art that emphasized the boxing, savate, or at least what he took as savate, Muay Thai, some Filipino martial arts, some many other martial arts. It was at one time said that Jeet Kune Do had elements from 26 different martial arts styles. That was a little bit of embellishment because where he may have taken inspiration from 26 different styles, there are not actual 26 different styles in that art as of being techniques that you practice. There's not. But I would say that he was in, it took inspiration from at least 26 different styles that he studied, whether reading books or looking at video footage or actually working out with people who knew those styles. And I'm not gonna belabor those 26 different styles, but heavily involved in Jeet Kune Do, which is the art of the intercepting fist, was savate, and I promise to go over that more. This is French kickboxing, which developed in the rough streets of Paris and Marseille. It's a sort of kickboxing where you wear the emphasize wearing uh, shoes or boots, hard-toed boots, and it emphasizes things like intercepting people. Okay, um, and it's sort of mysterious that Jeet doesn't give enough props to that, or some people don't within that that world. Um, he also tried to emphasize what he took to be Muay Thai at the time. Whether he got it correct or not, different subject. Boxing, of course, um, epee fencing, and he started doing a lot with grappling too, under like people Judo Jean LaBelle, Wally J, stuff like that. But it didn't become a formal part of his curriculum, although he did personally study grappling and at one point wanted to emphasize how important it was for a fighter to know, grappling and ground fighting, from, some of the stuff he was learning at the time in wrestling, judo, and jujitsu, traditional jujitsu. Uh, but after he died, like I said, um, you know, it wasn't exactly sure what was going to happen because, like I said, in private conversations, Lee had told Inosanto he didn't want Chikuno to become a commercialized martial art like the big ones now, like karate, kung fu, judo, stuff like that. So he taught a lot of people that privately, whereas he taught mostly the other Southeast Asian martial arts when he did like formal lectures and seminars. But he called it Jeet Kune Do concepts because people still wanted to know more about Bruce Lee's arts. And at this time in the late '70s and so forth, like I said, most of his original students from the late '50s, early '60s weren't weren't practicing anymore or weren't teaching anymore. and it was pretty much just the stuff coming out of Bruce Lee's original schools. They were still teaching students, and of course there was this kung fu craze in the 70s. So you know you had Jeet Kune Do coming in, and some people wanted to learn that, and you know Black Belt magazine was heavily marketing Bruce Lee. So there you go. And Jeet Kune Do had two eras in the South. There was the early Jeet Kune Do, which still emphasized the Wing Chun trapping, and there was the later Jeet Kune Do, because again, according to what Dan and DeSanto said in interviews, when Bruce came back from Hong Kong to visit, he told Dan, trapping is out. Trapping is like the close infighting skills using your hands and arms, just heavily emphasized in Wing Chun Kung Fu and some other Kung Fu styles and some other Southeast Asian martial arts like Kali. He didn't think it was useful anymore because of, as he got more experience with other types of fighters, he just thought that a lot of the Wing Chun trapping just wasn't practical anymore. You know, and he has some thoughts on how useful the Filipino martial arts were as well. So, you know, Inosanto, being the good friend and student, listened to him. And so Jeet Kune Do, as we know it, is more towards that late side. Okay. And then there's what I specialize in, Jeet Kune Do kickboxing, which was like further refinement of Jeet Kune Do in the mid to late 70s. Once Dan and DeSanto had got more instruction in formal Savat, um, and in Muay Thai under Ajahn Chai Surasute, as I mentioned in the previous video. And that was added into it. Some people used to call it dirty Muay Thai. um, but I love, you know, Jeet Kune Do kickboxing. It pretty much doesn't have many elements of trapping in it. It's mostly just the boxing, the kicking, and it was further refined with Filipino dirty boxing known as Panantukan, and with Filipino kickboxing, which is called Sikaran. I may be mispronouncing that. If I have any Filipino followers, you can correct my pronunciation. But with Panantukan and Sikaran, Muay Thai, Savat, Western boxing, these became the core of Jeet Kune Do kickboxing. Now we get into the 80s and the 90s, and a lot of these old students of Bruce wanted to capitalize on the martial arts craze going on with the Kung Fu craze in the 70s and the ninja craze in the 80s. And by the early 90s, they formed something called the Jeet Kune Do Nucleus with the Bruce Lee estate. And Dan was invited himself, but opted out because he thought that they were misrepresenting the art by calling what they were doing Jeet Kune Do, which wasn't. They were practicing Dao of Kung Fu and Jun Fan Gung Fu, which, though they were Bruce Lee's arts, they were not Jeet Kune Do. And then you had a schism with original Jeet Kune Do and Jeet Kune Do concepts. Original Jeet Kune Do being basically Jun Fan Gung Fu, and Jeet Kune Do concepts being the stuff that Inosanto taught. And ironically, a lot of the people who teach uh, so-called original JKD were students of Dan himself. So to say that he wasn't teaching it kind of is belied by the fact that he taught them. People like Jerry Poteet, which I mentioned previously when I said that there was a guy in the black belt online post on Facebook that disagreed with me that what Ron Balicki's drill he was showing wasn't Jeet Kune Do. And I was like, well, it's a lot, but it's a drill that we're taught in Jeet Kune Do. And that should have been pretty obvious if he was a Jeet Kune Do student. But then I realized he was one of those original JKD guys who thinks anything outside of the Jun Fan Gung Fu stuff is apocrypha to Jeet Kune Do. And no, I'm sorry. Dan teaches Jun Fan Gung Fu and Jeet Kune Do separately from the other arts if that's all you're interested in. Just like at MMA, if you go to an MMA gym and all you want to do is Muay Thai, you can just do Muay Thai. You don't have to do boxing. You don't have to do Brazilian Jiu Jitsu. You don't have to do wrestling. Conversely, if you just want to do Brazilian Jiu Jitsu and you're not interested in the striking arts, you can just do Brazilian Jiu Jitsu. It's the same thing at the Jeet Kune Do schools. The curriculum is broken up into different stuff. You have your strength your strength and conditioning. You have your different martial arts like Jun Fan Gung Fu and then Jeet Kune Do, which are taught separately or sometimes combined. But even when they're taught combined, it's strictly Jeet Kune Do as Bruce taught it before his death, not blended with the Filipino and Indonesian arts. Those are taught separately. The Salat classes are taught separately. There's a Savat class taught separately. And there's boxing classes taught separately. There's Brazilian Jiu Jitsu taught separately, and so forth. And so I hope that elucidated it a little bit. But it got muddied later on because then the term Jun Fan Jeet Kune Do was established by the Bruce Lee estate in the early 2000s to formalize what was to be considered Jeet Kune Do and what isn't. So those other arts that were taught in the concepts aren't part of Jun Fan Jeet Kune Do, just those original three arts that made up the system: Dao of Kung Fu, Jun Fan Gung Fu, and Jeet Kune Do. So that's it in a nutshell. But again, the other stuff that people learn in the Jeet Kune Do classes, that's part of the curriculum. And it shouldn't be that confusing. But people want to make it hard because there's a lot of people who are magical thinking they come into Asian martial arts, unfortunately. But I'm just a contrarian, guys.